And for me, it's a great honor and a great pleasure to introduce Sir Tim Berners-Lee for tonight's keynote. This Tim, and I need to make sure I don't mix up my Tims, this Tim is of course a British scientist, London-born and widely recognized as the inventor of the World Wide Web. He proposed the idea for it in 1989 when working at the CERN laboratory in Geneva. It was a global hypertext project to be run over the internet. It was essentially designed to allow people to work together by combining their knowledge in a web of hypertext documents. And the first ever web page, if that ever comes up in a pub quiz, the first ever web page worldwide was launched in 1990, and by 1991 people from outside CERN were also using it. They were becoming part of the new web community. And what was crucial for the growth of the World Wide Web was that CERN announced in 1993 that the World Wide Web technology would be available for anyone to use on a royalty-free basis. And we know the rest. The web has changed the world, and today there are an estimated 1.7 billion people using the web. And many of us wish there were more users right now. Since the 1990s, Sir Tim Berners-Lee has worked tirelessly to keep the web free and open, as a resource for all humanity. In 1994, Tim founded the World Wide Web Consortium, bit of a mouthful, as a place for different stakeholders to reach consensus around the specifications and guidelines to ensure that the web works for everyone and that it evolves in a responsible manner. The World Wide Web Consortium standards have enabled, among many other things, that people speaking different languages and people with disabilities can access the web. Tim is director of the World Wide Web Consortium, the World Wide Web Foundation, and the Web Science Trust. He's professor at MIT and at the University of Southampton. He's the author of Weaving the Web. He's won several international awards. Just looking through, I kind of stopped at counting at number 30. And he holds 12 honorary degrees and was knighted in 2004. However, for me, as someone who's interested in power structures and in the ideologies related to technologies, I'm actually much more impressed than with any of these awards, in that Tim is someone who's created a technological thing, but he hasn't stopped there. He went on to think about what intended and unintended consequences of this technology might be. He's also someone who continues to try to work and understands the powerful economic and political interests at work around a new technology. And he's someone who's then actively engaged with policy and with governance to fight for social change, positive social change, not just for the many, not just for the few, but also for the many, and for them worldwide. So, for me, Sir Tim is uniquely placed to give a keynote at this particular conference. He will speak, and then his team will join him for questions afterwards. And hopefully you'll get the opportunity to hear someone who's really not just created a technology, but thought about the social implications, talk about the World Wide Web and development tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, please welcome our keynote speaker, Sir Tim Berners-Lee.
Thanks. Well, I should start off with a huge disclaimer. Here I am giving a keynote speech at a conference which is an academic field and a discipline which I'm not an expert at all. I'm a field expert in some related fields. But let me, I'll explain, I suppose, taking on from where you left off, where I'm coming from chronologically. yeah, so the sort of the idea was in 1989 and the code in 1990, and from then on there were a few years of trying to persuade everybody that it would be a good idea, that hypertext wouldn't be too complicated, etc. But then in 93 it became clear that the thing was really picking up speed, picking up momentum, and it needed to be steered. And I came across more and more people who were concerned about it being steered, and perhaps some of them being concerned about steering it. So 1992 I started talking to people. 1993 it was clear we should start the World Wide Web Consortium. MIT started that, but started it with two bases, one at Imola in France, and later on I got a third base in Japan. The idea is that it should be international, and it should be a consortium of industry and other interested people who were interested in the technology of the web, the standards, the open standards which made it work, and in developing those standards so that it would work new and be better. So W3C, so W3.org, that was put together initially in 1994. At that point I left Switzerland, personally moved to MIT, because the web, even though, yes, it had been invented in Switzerland, but the internet had been developed in the US, and the US was the center of gravity of it because it had spread throughout the American university network. So it was the American academic network. So the web spread across that very quickly, so then the center of gravity of the web was therefore in the US, and one had to be, I felt, in the US in order to be able to coordinate it. So, but W3C is very much an international thing, and it's worked, as I say, in standards, and it's looked after, certainly trying to make sure that, from the point of view internationalization and accessibility, that it does try to cater to everybody, to try to make it as inclusive as possible. But then, more recently, a few years ago, on the side, I'm also doing some research into what I think is a little bit further out. So, for example, from a research point of view, I've been interested in what happens if we get all this semantic web technology, all this linked data out. What would be the ultimate user interface to it? What would be how would we make machines answer arbitrary questions, given a mass of knowledge out there and things like that? And when talking to other people, for example, at Southampton about it, we found that we were, and some of our best friends and colleagues were in a bit of a vacuum, in that some of the people who really were doing their thinking in the web, who got the web, didn't have journals to publish their stuff in. They didn't really have a field. And we realized that the common thing that lots of people had was they'd be doing something which, for example, they would be doing something like single sign-on for the web, which is an interesting problem. Things like OpenID, which are not really, from the point of view of cryptography, they're not the latest thing. They're not zero knowledge proofs. They're not the things that you can put in cryptography magazines. So where are you going to write up about something like a single sign-on system? About something which is web-like, decentralized, works because of social forces constrained by technical protocols. And so we started talking about web science and promoting the idea of web science, and so now there is web science. You can be a web scientist. Hold your hand up if you consider yourself a web scientist. Obviously the meme has got to travel a little further. But yes, way to go. You should talk about yourself as a web scientist, because then you can go to another set of conferences, publish that in another set of... But web science is tricky because it's multidisciplinary, because when you actually because you might look at the thing as being interaction between computers, but it's not, because what's interesting are the links. And when somebody follows a link, yes, it's computers that send HTTP messages, but who made the link? It's a person very often that made the link. On a good day, the person made the link because they were thinking about interactions with other people. So you need psychology to think about that. In fact, you need economics, you need mathematics for complex systems. The web now is a very complex system, so it's got 10 to the power 11 web pages out there roughly. That is about slightly more than the number of neurons in your brain. About the same size, except the number of neurons in your brain is going down, number of web pages is going up. Sorry. But clearly the web then has to be the object of study, and it has to be the object of engineering. So we produced this idea of web science, and with that we produced what is now the Web Science Trust. And when we were sitting there, and the purpose of this story is that we were sitting there thinking, what should the mission be of the Web Science Trust? What is this science, this multidisciplinary thing trying to do? And the best way we can sum it up is that it should try to ensure that this goal should be that the web should serve humanity. And then when we looked at that as the Web Science Trust motto, we thought, wow, that's a bit of a bigger job than it's all very well, but when you say humanity like that in the same sentence, then you realise that actually, at the time, 80% roughly of the world didn't use the web. So that was one of the pieces of thinking. There were many other pieces of thinking as well that led to the formation of the Web Science Foundation, the World Wide Web Foundation. So the Web Foundation formed a couple of years ago. It's a non-profit foundation based in Switzerland, and it has a US foundation. Just in case you're a US taxpayer and you're thinking of donating before the end of the tax year, we can make everything very easy for you, whatever nationality you are. But so it's one of these foundations. It's like a family foundation without a family. You know, we created it without having a desperate need to be able to invest masses of money. But instead, just because we felt there was a desperate need actually to look at how the web was serving humanity. And so that's what brought me and brought us, various people who are around here. Some of you will meet in a few minutes to the Web Foundation and to ICT for Development. And obviously it brought us into lots of other things. We've obviously been talking to all the people that we could find who have been thinking about it from different angles. So this place is great. We have been to people in the university, seen people in the universities. We've been to various countries, particularly in Africa. Some very interesting trips there to find out really how people do use the internet or don't use the internet, or do use SMS and don't use SMS. To see what the difference is between dropping in on a telecentre on a pre-announced visit and dropping in on a telecentre which you just found by the side of the road, and so on. So that has been really amazing. So that obviously this whole field, it covers so much, and I'm not going to talk about anything like bits, like all of that, but I'll go over some of it. Some bits that have that have cropped up, or that are involved in some of the projects, little projects, very much starting experimenting projects that the Web Foundation has got involved in with various partners since then. A lot of people, when you talk to them and say that, well, the problem is that only 80% of the world are using the web, the immediate response is, oh yes, how can we get that fibre, out? But now the fibre's got there, hasn't it? Won't that be great? And in fact, our trip, one of the exciting things about the time when we went to Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda, is that when we arrived at Rwanda, the former two, they just had the cable, and at the Rwanda there was some 50 yards that they hadn't dug yet, and they were all very excited about it, but we could see their reactions to this. But of course, when we talk about using the web, we mean becoming part of the information society, it becoming part of your life, you actually getting all the quality of life things that we get out of it, all the quality of work things, the quality of play things, the quality of health, the economic benefit. So it's not just getting connected, and it's not just having a device that uses it, although that's part of it. So we have got involved in some of those projects. It's been interesting talking to Paul English and the folks with his joinafrica.org idea that, you know what, because so many people, of the rich people, have video, and because that is so many gigabytes, why not make kilobytes free? Why don't you just make low bandwidth connectivity free? I think that was a brilliant idea. There are lots of, he's thinking about doing it by saying, look, if you're going to have any sort of internet connectivity that you're selling in the city, you should be putting, or you should be allowing him to put on the lampposts little Wi-Fi boxes, and you will mesh those Wi-Fi boxes somewhere along the line, so one of those Wi-Fi boxes will be dropped into your network, and you will just commit that for the privilege of running it as an ISP in this country, 10% of your outbound backhaul will be free, will be this free stuff. And you'll be surprised, and of course the people, and then it was in Mexico, talked to an ISP, somebody who had actually, a telco, who had actually ended up being, I understand, more or less forced into a position where they, for particular places, they were required to provide very low bandwidth connectivity for free, and finding that those places took off actually, and they got their return on investment faster than where they were providing it for money, because it's so addictive. But you can do so much. You can run a business with actually very, very little bandwidth. That's one of the things that I think is interesting. So we ended up talking to people doing power. That's been exciting, because obviously often it comes down, when you follow the why are you not using the internet sort of decision tree, it comes down to, well, I've got a phone but I can't charge it up. So then you find the people who are putting in the solar power, and the wind power, and the water power, and then you talk to them and find out that they've gone to a lot of trouble. Actually, never mind the solar panel, but the main thing is either persuading the village to take care of the solar panel, or putting it in some cast iron box that nobody can get at, and then with a little, but through which you could put an internet terminal. And you realise that actually, once you've done that, the solar panel was very expensive, much more expensive than the little Wi-Fi router. We were saying, we said to some of those people, if you're going to put a solar panel in there, for each one, please just put a Wi-Fi router. And now I'm thinking, talking to people about doing this stuff in communities, maybe not just a Wi-Fi router, maybe you should put a little server, and all the stuff will can't fit. We're getting these little blue cards, which have got USB things on them. It only uses a little bit of fold-out plastic to put all the conference proceedings on the rest. If you use the whole rest of the card, you'd probably better put a Wi-Fi router and a web server with blogging and Twitter. Okay, so next net conference, whoever's organizing the next conference, make sure they go away with a card with on it the Wi-Fi, the complete community server. So you put this little card, connect it up next to the solar panels. Okay, it does Wi-Fi, and everybody in the village can then blog, and you get them blogging, and you get generating local content, which is automatically in their own language without you even having to translate it. I think, among most of the people I've talked to here, I think there's an understanding that it is actually much more important to get people doing things locally in the community, generating their own content, rather than I apologise if you've got, your project is one of these ones where you're taking healthcare information produced by the large pharmaceutical companies in America and dispensing it to grateful hands, clutching at it from developing countries. But I think most people realise that where it's at is bottom up, grassroots stuff, and that's what people need and what people put the energy into. And then if you've got them blogging locally and then connect somehow at low bandwidth overnight, maybe by driving around a truck with a disk on it, you connect up those things. Anyway, so the corridors are full of all these exciting ideas. So I just sort of throw some of them out at you, because I say I'm not going to give you, I'm not an expert, so I can't give you graphs where I show meticulously figured out methodologies for demonstrating the causality between various things. So I'm afraid I spend a lot of my time in anecdote world. But as a scientist, I actually realize that a lot of people spend their time in anecdote world, and so I do really appreciate that people like you do good studies with good methodology, produce your data. By the way, please produce your data in good open standards. You can go to W3C and you can find those standards. You can put them in CSV or XML, and you can put ideally in RDF. Make sure look up 5-star link data. Do that. End of plug. But yes, you should do open data. But I'm glad that there are people who are looking at the causality, because I have a sneaky feeling that there are an awful lot of very well-meaning interventions that people have done where they haven't really done the experimentation. It's been really interesting listening to one of my colleagues at MIT, Esther Duflo, talking about that and doing experiments and stuff to actually prove things. So let's look at some of the, just let me go over a few things that the Web Foundation's been doing. One of them is an easy segue in that it's following on from some project I got involved in the UK at the end of Gordon Brown's era as Prime Minister. He asked me what UK should do to make the best use of the internet. I said, put your government data on the web. And he said, okay, which was pretty good. And we had, so did lots of ministers, and so did lots of grassroots people who'd been wanting to do it for ages. And so there was a project to put UK government data on the web, which was competing for being the first at each thing with the US Obama project to do the similar thing in data.gov. Yeah, no, it should be data.gov.usa, shouldn't it? Okay, but yes, okay, data.gov. We'll let that one go. So data.gov and data.gov.uk had this competition. And so that leads you to think that this open data is the sort of thing that when a country has made it to being a developed country, then now it is time to show how developed you are by actually enabling your population to be very geeky and to do things like pull data from the government about what the government is doing and recycle it in websites and talk about it with your fellow voters and push back on your government where you think the government may be making a mistake. Well, that turns out that in fact then we came across a whole lot of people like the Media Foundation people who actually thought that that was an important thing for developing countries. In fact, they thought it was a more important thing for developing countries, because in developing countries you need more transparency because there is less trust, because there is more corruption. In a typical, not in all developing countries, but in a lot of developing countries, there is a lot of corruption. And if you can provide transparency, if you can see that when somebody was given a grant for X amount of money, they then put a web page up which says, I got X at this date, and I divide it up into X1, X2, X3, X4, X5, and if you follow these links to you'll find the web pages of the people to whom I gave the money, and they're saying the same thing. So everybody recursively will explain what they did with the money until we get down to $500 levels, or until we know how many nails have been paid for by the World Bank, for example. Now, which perhaps would be a little bit bureaucratic to go that far, but there are lots of really interesting things that you could do if that information, of course, were available. So the World Wide Web Foundation, in fact, had a very small embryonic project to just look at the readiness of. In fact, they looked at Ghana and Chile, two countries. And it's great to meet somebody whose name I forget. I just met, who was looking at it throughout the South American countries, looking at to what extent are these governments ready, how far are they along the path of being open, do they realize about using open standards, and so on. In fact, we have a 5-star system. I have a 5-star system, which I made up more or less during a talk in answer to your question. My first star, you get the data on the web at all with an open license. Well done. You get a huge star. This is the biggest star. Second star is you get the government on the web, the data on the web in machine-readable form. So if you have scanned a fax of the data table and put that out as a PDF, then do not apply for the second star. But otherwise, if you put a word processor, a spreadsheet up there, you get the second star. If the spreadsheet is a proprietary format, you cannot apply for the third star. You don't get the third star until it's open standard, but I'm not fussy. You can put it up in XML, you can put it up in CSV, that is great. I don't think anybody's ever written a standard for CSV because it's so simple. Just use it. If you use RDF is a really interesting, that's the linked data standard. Okay, you can go to the wc.org site, you can find out how to do that in RDF. When you do that, then each of the things you're talking about, each of the rows in your table gets a URI, so I can link to it. And I can say, you know what? That Burkina Faso that they're talking about, that's the same Burkina Faso as we're talking about, and so on. And people could say, population, when they talk about population, 2010 population, that's the same thing as we're talking about here when we talk about population. So you can link things together. So you get 4 stars if you provide data in this linkable form using RDF Sparkle, the whole set of linked data standards which are out there. The fifth star you get if you've done some linking. And obviously, if you've done research in this area, you know that linking the data up is what you've probably spent an awful lot of time doing. So for anybody who goes out there and links either their data or somebody else's data, is doing something very valuable. When you link it up, for example, countries and places you can link to the open maps, you can link them to the DBpedia, which is a big example in linked data of all the data in Wikipedia and so on. So that is open government data. Open government data is something which should not just apply to developed countries. How are we going to get there? So the Web Foundation has been looking at it, very interested in collaborating with anybody who's also doing that. I think one of the things which may be interesting, but certainly even in the developed world, there's a lack of people who have done it. So taking the people who've done this, know what it's like, both socially to get the first star, also technically to get the other stars. Taking them, getting them to give seminars to people who promise each to give seminars to 6 people, sort of thing, and so to get this to grow virally is something which is just one of the many things that we could think about doing. So that's one of the things the Web Foundation has been doing. Another thing, one of the questions I often get is, okay, so what do you think about the PC versus the mobile phone? The Web Consortium spent many years trying to get people to realize that the mobile web was really important. And the fact that, partly, of course, it was so that your executives who have 2 iPhone 4s in each pocket could browse the web while they're on their plane, private plane. But in fact, the fact that the most developing world only have mobile phones was probably a bit more of a driver. But interestingly enough, those two things connected together. And the Web Foundation also has got a strong theme. They have a project trying to get entrepreneurs to understand about mobile technology, to understand what they need to do, whether it's using SMS messages, or whether in fact there's a clientele out there which have got mobile devices. How do you getting them to realize that actually a web server is something that you can make? Something I don't know if I found anybody sort of out there in my wanderings in Africa who, and certainly not young people who were blogging, because they read other people's blogs, they didn't realize they could blog. So getting your entrepreneur to realize, actually, you can set up a dial-in service, you can set up an SMS sort of service using a cell phone and a computer connected together, and you can start running a business or making it or running a service as an NGO just like that. You don't have to be a great big company. You don't have to be a great big company to participate. But in developing countries, obviously you're liable to have to learn how to deal with mobile devices. You're not going to use the same parameters as a lot of people come out of sort of web design school with nowadays. You may in fact be not just using the web and SMS, you may also be designing things based on voice technology. Voice technology is interesting for lots of ways. Lots of people who don't have data plans. I must rant about. Remind me to if I finish this talk and I haven't ranted about data plans, then remind me to. So for various reasons, people don't have data. They only have voice, and so if you want to help them, then you need to talk voice to them. And now, of course, computers talk voice, and in fact, there are standards for writing the dialogues, so that you can write. You can create a voice application very easily, and then you can try running it. And some of the software is open source, and some of it isn't. It's always good to pick software which uses the standards there. So the idea here is that similarly, just as getting people to understand the mobile web, it's allowing people to use, and people out there in developing countries to use use voice technologies to do this. And of course, illiteracy, it's not just being poor or disconnected. For a huge amount of developing countries, in which I include, for example, America, there is illiteracy is a big problem. So I sort of emphasize again that point. I might emphasize it 4 or 5 times during this talk. Open standards. Make sure when you're deploying any kind of IT, in fact, try to make sure that you're not allowing some IT producer to get this new clientele locked into a proprietary vendor locking by ending up with all their configuration data being in a vendor specific format. I mean, we fought all those battles, and open standards have dramatically won as the web exploded. But it's amazing. Every now and again, wham! We find we have to fight them all again, and so we have to be on our guard. Okay, in developing countries, to make sure there won't be places where, through lack of education, people don't realise that they should be looking at these open standards. So, in general, out there, the projects you could think of doing are very wide and very varied. And I think that one of the interesting things I look to this community for is both understanding the causality, obviously, but also that inherent in that is having some metrics. In a way, metrics are useful in a number of ways. They're useful for being able to talk about how things have changed. But in a way, also, they're useful for being able to make value judgments about what you think is important. So out there, when you look at how a country is doing, it would be great to have metrics in these different areas so that we can see, like the talk this morning, try and look at the history and figure out the causality and work out how to plan the things we should be encouraging them to do. But also, so that in the end, we can, based on that science, we can then look at it and say, okay, this is going to be how we're going to put together a number which is going to tell us how we're doing in the whole field. This is the ICT for development number. And basically, if you come to this conference, your job is to make that number go higher. And it's the conference's job to help us figure out what should go into that number and to produce the individual pieces. So there are various forms of metric, and particularly in economic development out there. Now, the access to the web and being part of the information society is as important in lots of ways, really, as how much people bring home. I was a little frightened by the tales I heard in the corridor of the extent to which people are motivated to get information technology, the extent to which they will spend money they don't have on a cell phone, the extent to which they will do things that they wouldn't do, rather like people who need money for drugs. So that's a little bit frightening. So maybe we also have to be careful that as the wave of technology arrives, that people don't overreact to it. But those all demonstrate that this is powerful stuff we're playing with. Okay, we find it exciting. A lot of people, the younger part of you won't be able to remember really what it was like before clicking, and a lot of you people don't really. A lot of young people now don't really have an understanding of what, for example, what it was like, what it meant that there was an internet for 20 years before the web. You what? How do you mean? Isn't it the same thing? And what did that mean? And then and they have to, and if you ask them to imagine what it was like before the internet, then they'll probably go back to sort of paintings on cave walls and things, and the dawn of prehistory. So we have to realize that people are going through this transition. We have to make sure that it's going to happen in a fair way. Well, so I wanted to rant about data plans. For a long time, I had a phone. When I grew up in this country, I grew up with one of those people who used to make fun of those Americans who had cell phones. And then when we got cell phones, we still made fun of people who used them while they were walking along. And now, of course, I joined the mass of people who use cell phones when they're walking along. And slowly I moved from the people who sort of thought that it was a bit of an executive thing to have a data plan, and it was too expensive really typically to have it on your phone. But I still live in a world where when I get a phone, a typical phone, the data plan is something which is extra. A basic phone plan, if you're economizing, you get yourself a basic phone, and even though your basic phone has all kinds of data facilities on it, if you want to get a data plan, then you pay a bunch extra, even if it's just GPRS, very low bandwidth, but just narrowband data. You have to pay a whole lot more per month just to have data. Even though the amount of data you're going to be able to put through that connection is a whole lot less than you're using for your voice. So now your voice, of course, is being encoded as bits. And the amount of only one of these narrowband things, the amount of bandwidth you're using with the data is very much smaller than the amount you're using for voice. And in fact, a lot of places around here I found that even with something which calls itself 3G in 4 bars, I can only get a very small amount of data compared to what I would expect is being used by the voice channel. So, in fact, when it comes to the load this is putting on the system, the fact that I've got data is not very much. There is a huge step for a lot of people of actually getting that data plan, learning how to use it, finding it on a phone which isn't really a sort of latest top-of-the-range 3G phone, with a smartphone. Finding the web browser in the applications might be quite difficult. Certainly, even though you can afford it, the effort of going through changing your plan is quite small, is quite large. There are countries also where, because this is seen as being the sort of thing which a few executives upgrade to, it's seen as something that you can tax. So that you put taxation onto the data plan which you wouldn't put onto the voice plan. So all this really pushes against the idea that that it would be great to get low bandwidth connectivity to everybody. So suppose we turn it all around and say, okay, when you get your phone, you get 1200 baud. Anybody remember what it was like using a 1200 baud modem? Those with significant grey hair. Put that. You don't remember what it was like using 1200 baud. So anyway, you remember that sort of instead of then. And your screen would fill like this, and screens filling like this was perfectly acceptable actually. It was so much better than the 300 baud. Okay, suppose we get when they would fill like this. But in fact, you could do things. The Minitel in France, you could do, was a huge industry. Transformed France, or maybe anyway, well, in some direction. Looking at my French colleagues in the front there. So. Supposing instead we say when you get anything, you get this 1200 baud, which will allow you to do simple things like, how many bits does it need to find out what your bank balance is? How many bits does it need, in fact, to transfer money from one person to another, which is a huge enabler. Even to transfer money over an encrypted link, there's not very many bits involved. So to do the basis of e-commerce, in fact, all kinds of things you could do. For all these things that you hear about being such enablers, finding out what the market price of your product is in a village on the other side of the hill before you have to hump all your stuff over the hill to find out, and so you can find out which market to go to, so on. Being able to figure out whether your middleman is ripping you off by figuring out what the market prices are, figuring out what the weather forecast is for the next week, for example, if you're an arable farmer, and so on. All these things are really, really small amounts of information. And so, supposing we get people on that, we get everybody getting that for free, they will want to buy those that can will certainly have a tremendous urge to upgrade. So don't worry, the upsell is there, folks. You will be, the ISPs, you will be selling lots and lots of high bandwidth directions. And when you do it, you don't have to teach people how to use the data because they've already found the web browser, because the moment you gave them the cell in the shop, you were showing them how to use the web browser, even though it was only doing text and it wasn't doing videos. So, for wireless as well as for landlines and Wi-Fi, we should turn the whole data plan thing and the way that these things are taxed all around. So I've gone around a few things that the Web Foundation's done. Did I talk about Burkina Faso? That was an early one. That was in the area of helping people use information technology. The farmer who'd figured out what you have to do to the hard, parched ground, which after the drought had come and there was no more green, what you had to do to it, how to drill the holes so that when it rained, the rain would go into the holes and stay there and then soak in. How to bury the seeds with a little bit of compost and a little bit of animal manure on top of them, so that, and so on, little recipes for actually bringing back, regreening the Sahel, which had been devastated by drought. This message, which as the message about it spread, you could see it from satellite photos, turning that space of North Africa back to green. So that they've got a project which is just trying to find out how best information technology can be used for spreading that really important message as quickly as possible, without having to just bus farmers all to the original guy and get them to explain, on the spot. So that's one. So that's another project in an area where of huge number of projects, obviously, where it's using IT for useful things. But I think in general, what's amazing about this field is the way everything interconnects. I must admit, there was a time a few years ago when I was sitting on a log by a lake in New Hampshire, sitting next to somebody who had a cabin a few doors down the lake, and who'd been a missionary and had gone out to war-torn parts of Africa, and her expertise was helping people re-establish after they'd been criminally traumatized, re-establish normality, find their way back to normality. And I sort of said apologetically that I imagined that it would be foolish to imagine that we should be talking about giving internet connectivity to people before they've got health and before they've got clean water. And I thought that was a sort of a given. And I thought it would be huge hubris to imagine that we should talk about giving them data phones when they haven't got a piece of PVC piping. And in fact, we should all down tools stop typing and go over and basically just work to get the PVC piping in so that they can get their clean water. And she said, well, yes and no. When she told me the story of somebody that she knew who was in a village which did not have water, but it did get some kind of telephone connectivity. And this guy, now she said, she was a missionary, Christian missionary, and she reckoned that he taught himself English because he had a version of the Bible in his own language and a version of the Bible in English. I'm suspicious of that. I can't see myself learning another language that way. But I guess it would depend very much on which version of the Bible, but what sort of English he would learn. But apparently he taught himself enough English to be able to earn his living translating from English into his own tongue, which is the easy way, called the natural way to go. And so, in fact, once he got a connection, he could get things, he could sell his services, and all he needed was to be able to get an email in English and then send back the email of the equivalent in his own tongue. And then he's doing two things. One is, he's actually part of connecting his village, because his village, as I was saying at the beginning, it's not just about being connected, it's about being able to actually converse and interact and be part of the information economy, and to do that, having people doing translation is very useful. So he was actually being a significant other part of the solution, even though his main motivation might have been the other, of course, that he actually gained what was a significant income, which would allow him to do things in the village, such as buy pieces of PVC piping, which would then assure him of water supply, and which would then help him work on his own health and the health of the people around him. And since then, we have heard so many tales, including here, of the way these things just are entwined, the economic development, and health, and the social development, and the political development as well, and the development of connectivity and use of the web are all entwined together. And a good time, they all reinforce each other, and they happen at the same time. And my feeling is if we can get them, all the people working in these different fields together, then working on all these things, understanding them all, and communicating, for example, at conferences like this, then maybe we'll end up, the whole thing will be self-reinforcing, and it will happen. We will get things happening in 10 years where they would have taken, in 18 months where they would have taken 10 years. So I think just because we understand it and we get it right, and we all work together across this interdisciplinary field, which is, I think, so important for the world. Thank you.